Welcome back to Something You Can Do, a podcast for those hungry for action steps. I'm your host, KJ Kozak, and today I'm joined by a guest who will talk us through things that you can do to help bring a little bit of kindness and generosity into your life. Let's get into it. So today I have the pleasure of being here with Brian Dabb. Brian's an HR professional who believes no one should wake up dreading their workday, but we actually met many years ago in the George Washington Univ pledge class of APO, Alpha Phi Omega, Community Service Fraternity. So quite a journey. It's so exciting to have you here. Brian, what is something you can do?
Thank you for having me. So we often think about kindness as sort of an inherent personality trait. Some people are sweet person, kind person, some people are not. Something I've come to believe is that kindness is an energy choice. Throughout our day, we have tons of, friction points, slow barista, confusing email, messy kitchen. And in those moments, our brain naturally wants to take a reactive path, which is lower energy. And that results in being dismissive or snarky. Don't get me wrong. I love some snark and some sarcasm in my sense of humor. But I've also learned that there's something I call the generous pivot. And that's the something that we can do. This intentional act of kind of pausing to think about why we're feeling, and how we might move forward.
I love this as a thing you can do, especially because it's something that I was actually talking to a couple people about before the holidays, right? Like, what do we do when we're getting a lot of negative energy? And it's so easy to just return that negative energy. So why is this generous pivot something that you can do?
For me personally, it's been a journey in my life of learning how to be intentional and take those pauses. I feel like growing up, I thought of myself as really the nicest person in the world. And as I grew up and grew into my personality and learned more about the world, I, took on some rougher edges and have some of that sense of humor. And in moments, especially professionally, I've realized how making that generous pivot really helps people, helps maintain positive energy. And, without knowing what other people are going through, trying to kind of give them the benefit of the doubt in the same way that I would, knowing that I have some bad days. But generally speaking, it doesn't take much for anyone to start. There are things you can do to start today. One thing, for example, is just trying to start bringing some more awareness to how you might react in a situation. And maybe you still do lean into that snarky or sarcastic response. But those are also the moments where I've then kicked myself afterwards and said, okay, that was the moment I should have maybe taken that pause to think about how I responded.
Yeah, that's extremely relatable to me as a person. I think oftentimes having that impulse of especially when you have something that's kind of funny and you just sort of lead with that nasty thing that's because it's funny and you need to make yourself laugh, and being able to take a second and that step back of maybe no, maybe that's not the right energy. I love the way you're talking about the energy that we're putting out into the world. So, what are the steps involved? Walk us through what this generous pivot looks like.
Yeah. So one example I'll start with really is with my partner a lot. I like having a clean kitchen, in particular with dishes. And, especially at kind of the end of the day when I'm tired, there's actually an acronym I learned about when preparing and reflecting on this conversation called HALT. It's hunger, anxiety, loneliness, or there's a fourth one, but there's states of mind where we are sort of more primed for that snarky, sarcastic response. So if I sense that in myself, and I would say that's really the first step, is training yourself to bring that awareness. Second step is taking that pause. It can be a counting to yourself for 3. It could be taking a deep breath. Although sometimes my partners notice that if I'm taking a deep breath, it sounds like a sigh, and then you can overinterpret from that. But,
yeah.
but then that comes with really the follow-up of communication. And that is, in some instances, it's saying, listen, I'm feeling frustrated right now, so my tone may come off with that. Can you receive that first? Are you okay hearing some of my frustration, and then we can talk about it? And that kind of lets him in on the state that I'm in and why I'm struggling to kind of come up with those generous words. But if I am having kind of that lucidity to pick a phrase, I might say, hey, I see there's a lot of dishes. Do you mind coming to lend me a hand? As opposed to thinking defensive or thinking, the thought typically is, how am I the only one that sees this? Like, is he blind? Does he not see all these dishes in the sink? But it really has nothing to do with that. Something I appreciate from my partner is he's been patient to enable me some of that space to like take a beat and either come back to him and reframe or kind of have that repair, or just asking for what I need. I mean, that's truly, I think, what comes down to a lot of this is us as humans being more comfortable just calmly asking, and then seeing what we get back, because then that has to do more with the other person as opposed to yourself.
There's so much in there that is so valuable and helpful and captures a lot of things that I think about frequently. One of them is I'm allowed to be upset. Like, I think that's something that I think is often kind of from the other side of what you're talking about. It's like, yeah, I'm allowed to just like be unhappy sometimes. But that doesn't make it okay to like take it out on someone else. And I think,
and that's why I like that tool. Sorry, I was just because that's why I think that tool of letting them in is what then builds stronger connection.
Exactly. Because when it's like, I am having this response like to this thing, whether it's dishes in the sink, or whatever it is. And even if it's with people that you're not super close to, like not with a partner, but just a coworker, a person out in the wild, like being able to, I'm really struck by the first kind of step that you mention is self-awareness. You have to understand what's going on and what that reaction is. Because I think that that's what helps us de-escalate these situations instead of just reacting to something that's coming at us. Especially because, like, what is it about this situation that's upsetting me? Maybe it's that I grew up in a house where a dirty sink meant that you weren't doing a good job. And so my response, or maybe I grew up in a house where if you cook dinner, you don't clean the kitchen. And so I'm having this response of you're letting me down or you don't understand what's going on. So being able to check in with yourself first. I guess those deeper sort of triggers may become secondary to like, and I love that you brought in, I think the hungry, angry, lonely, tired, where it's like, if one of those is kind of what's coming up for you, maybe you handle that first and then, because that's just going to continue to get in the way.
And that's part of the generous pivot too, is sometimes just not noticing that you don't have the energy to make the generous choice and just choosing not to say anything or pick the, shortest phrase that's like a thank you, see you later, something that kind of politely gets you out of that interaction or sort of enables you to remove yourself to kind of take that space, because you're right. We're all going to have a moment where we are upset. We're allowed to be upset. And if you can kind of make that conscious recognition that you can't be your best self in that moment, and been figuring out the best way you can kind of take yourself to have some time.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious too, because you use this word generous, and I'm wondering, what does generosity mean to you? Why this word when we're thinking about this kindness and this positive energy in the world?
I think generous could be replaced with also the word intentional. I think both come up in this frame because it takes intention to choose an alternate path. And I think the generosity comes in a few forms, kind of at a high level, sort of what I said at the beginning of not knowing what other people are going through. Something I thought about in barista example, you feel like the line's going really slow. The first thing I always come to is like, could they be understaffed today? And sure, that sucks and that's annoying to me, but there's very little power for anyone to do in that moment to change something. And like, maybe that's kind of a deeper level thinking to kind of go through in a moment where you just want your coffee. But kind of tapping into that, lend some generosity that the staff is doing the best they can. And, you can kind of just say nothing and be patient, or, when you get to the counter, say, hey, I know it's been really backed up. I appreciate how hard you're working. That sort of pro-social moment can perhaps also resolve what you feel about feeling frustrated. It can actually kind of turn your mindset if you sort of force that cognitive dissonance to say, well, I am annoyed about this taking a while, but I'm actually going to share my gratitude that I think they're doing their best. And now I sort of feel better about maybe it being a little slow. I don't feel as frustrated. So that's where I think kind of that generosity comes in at a sort of surface level, and then really just changing from something that's maybe less positive or to something that's more positive. I think that's really the generosity.
And what I think too, like that I'm really loving about the way that you're explaining this is that this generosity is something that you are doing or giving or creating versus I think sometimes, like, especially in our self-care soaked world of like compassion and mindfulness, and that this is really different from sort of just taking a step back and saying, well, maybe they have something tough going on. It's like, well, maybe they have something tough going on, and what can I put into the situation to steer it in a different way? And to me, that's where I'm really hearing that generosity, that giving, that abundance, that I think does make this different from just like a sort of compassion moment of checking in with yourself and practicing radical acceptance of the situation. Like, no, you have some agency here.
Yeah. And I want to call out actually a couple things I looked into from sort of the research side of it, of why it's so challenging. Because I think I don't want to gloss over that. Like, this is a process of creating a habit, and we know habits take time. And the first is this concept of like cognitive tax. And there's some research that suggests, empathy and kindness operate from a brain that works like a muscle. And when we're tired, when we have those halt features, it's harder to use our muscles because our brain is, literally trying to conserve energy, find the shortest routes, the lowest energy routes. And like we said, that tends to be sort of that snark and sarcastic reactionary response. And on top of that, there's some other research about the different perspectives we have when we're in sort of a positive or more negative mindset. And when we're sort of frustrated or having that more negative mindset, our perspective and our awareness really narrows. It's harder to see the silver lining in things. It's harder to choose, to feel positive. It's, the mind's powerful, but making that conscious choice is challenging. When you're in a positive mindset, it's so much easier to see the world and be aware of possibilities and, pick up on these opportunities to hold the door, express gratitude to someone, give a genuine response to how are you today, and be less of that sort of polite conversational interaction, but really like, this is how I'm feeling today. How are you doing? What's going on with you? That's all easier when we're in that more positive kind of frame. So I do recognize when you're standing in line, you need your caffeine, and you want to get to work. That makes that perspective harder to have.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think too, like building in um the muscle. I love that thinking about this in terms of something that you can practice, right? Because like this isn't necessarily a mind over matter thing, right? Where you're standing in line and everything is really rough and you just decide that it's going to be better, right? This is a little outlet towards how you respond to these things that can put you in a space where things are going to be a little bit easier.
I love that because you just reminded me something that I came into this year with in particular. More so, I've held on to than past years, which is I forget the exact phrase. You know, life is 10% of what happens to you, and 90% of how you respond to it. Whatever that sentiment is, and I think this really encapsulates those moments where we're choosing how to respond, how to react, because that's 90%. That's the majority of how we operate in the world, is how we're choosing to show up and respond to what's coming to us. And you know, I think it's not just positivity for positivity's sake. I think there is some, you know, research on the wiring in our brain and the strengthening of what connections bring you, and that happens more often when you're in a positive mindset.
1,000%. I mean, if we even just think about like the reward system in the brain, like you're going to get a hit of dopamine from being able to like get that crunchy, snarly barista to smile at you. And like that moment, I feel like many of us have experienced that where like you sort of interrupt that cycle of negativity and you watch somebody like relax a little bit. And like, that is a good hit of dopamine. That experience sends something to your brain that's like, good job. Do more of that.
And much stronger than a fleeting snarky joke that you may actually then feel crappy about afterwards, and won't fix your mindset in the moment. It'll keep you feeling frustrated, anxious, annoyed at the situation.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm thinking now of all of this. I think this is what's so useful about this is that, I mean, it's nice to be nice to people and to feel better and stuff. But when we really think about the mechanics of how and why that works, right? It's not just like, oh, in this abstract sense, it's nice to be nice to people. No, we literally are tapping into the reward systems and the reinforcement and the things that we want more of good things. And so when we like those systems of reward are good. And also, I will say that also can be what makes this so difficult, right? Is because it's not always going to work out that way. And you might really, really put a lot of energy into this generous pivot, and then people continue to kind of be nasty or things continue to go hard. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about like what can help people when this generous pivot is not immediately paying off.
My first thought is that has more to do about the other person in a lot of scenarios, than perhaps not having the energy in the moment to accept the generous pivot. And what I think people should try to take away from that is, you know, pride in themselves, feeling good that they made the choice to try to put more generosity out into the world through their response, and maybe come back to that in a curious way. Well, I didn't get the response I want. I wonder what's going on behind that. I hope they're going to be okay, but I'm going to move on because I feel like I did the right thing. Again, that's probably easier said than done. It's certainly frustrating when you try to put out something nice, someone's not accepting it. Luckily, or I shouldn't say luckily, I think depending on the relationship, you may also feel a little different. If my partner doesn't have the response I'm looking for, we should continue communicating and kind of resolve whatever disagreement we're having. If it's the barista, you can very easily just continue along on your day and be able to kind of leave it behind you. You don't need to really worry about repair, unless, you're like the customer of the month and you're always there and they know your order. Maybe you don't want them to spit in your coffee, but otherwise I think some amount of sort of sizing up the relationship and the dynamic and what is important in that moment will help navigate how you feel about someone's response.
1,000%. And I think those micro interactions are also, they build up to make up our whole day. And so I love this as a thing you can do, as something that is going to have a really big impact over time. So I know that you also spend a lot of your career-focused energy in the world of human resources and HR. And so I'm curious about how those experiences, I'm wondering if you could bring in from a professional perspective, how does this generous pivot relate to folks that are focusing on their career? How does this show up in a professional sense?
So in my HR career, and really I think this relates to almost any job, I've come to appreciate the value of curiosity. And that comes with asking good questions to really fully understand a scenario. Oftentimes I'd be in a meeting with either a client I was coaching or a partner I was working on a project with, and they made a suggestion or an approach or a comment that kind of threw me or made me think it didn't sound right and I was confused. And sort of rather than kind of come from maybe some judgment or even a snarky response in my head, tried to start, pivoting and leaning a lot more into curiosity, understanding what information do they have, do they not have? What perspective from where they sit am I missing? And how can I bring that information to better collaboration? So I think that's where the generous pivot helps, is with that collaboration. I often think about, especially working with people, I'm me sitting here with my responsibility, and so is here sitting with their responsibility. And I have my manager and people I'm accountable to, and they have their manager and people they're accountable to. And I think that really helps break down barriers to realize, everyone you're working with has their own world they're trying to navigate. And I think some understanding and, again, that being generous in your interpretation of how they're navigating helps build relationships, helps improve collaboration, and that comes from this communication approach.
I really think it's so important to lead with curiosity. And this is my favorite thing about this podcast, is digging in really specifically, because people say all the time, like, be curious, lead with curiosity. What the hell does that mean? It's like, what does that even mean? And and you're giving a really nice framework into, like, what does it mean to be curious? Like, what's actually happening in your head when you are leading with curiosity? You are taking a step back and you're thinking about context and you're thinking about history and you're asking yourself these very specific questions. What is this person maybe thinking? What information do they have? And so I think that it just, to me, is so important to make these things tangible and real, and not to say that we have to come up with we don't have to tell people what to do, but still to be able to make it grounded.
Yeah. I'll also share, I had a challenge, and I think this is always a challenge, not feeling like I don't know what I don't know. And that sometimes will hold me back from asking any questions or feeling like I knew the right questions. And it's certainly challenging to kind of not necessarily have a track of questions to ask. But that's also where sometimes I would really just say, like, look, I really don't know a whole lot about your world. I'm pretty much a novice. Can you help bring me in a little bit on, give me an overview. Can we start there? I love just finding a starting place, right? I'm always thinking of, different, threads or levers I can kind of grab onto, something to grab onto that then gives me a way in, a way to then find questions, things I'm curious about that I know will help me. So it can be challenging. I worked on a project where I kept kind of asking the most questions I could around, what haven't I asked you? What would you want to ask yourself if you were me? What would you want someone who reports to you to ask? Trying to think of that. And, I later on was in a meeting with my manager at the time and got feedback that they didn't think I went deep enough. So that was a challenging learning experience to feel like, well, I did the best I could, but maybe there was still more I could have dug into. So again, we'll vary by situation, but I think if you can find a place to start, or even if it's just with, there's a lot I don't know, what can you tell me?
And that's, I think, too, where this generosity comes in of like bringing in the other person's experience and expertise and viewpoint without putting the work on them, right? To be able to ask those questions and get more information and help center them in the situation instead of it being like, well, this is a you problem or this is a me problem, which I think often happens in work situations when there's any friction at all. We live in such a weird cultural time of like this sort of abdication of responsibility in the name of self-preservation or boundaries. And so I think that this specific tool of starting with that self-awareness, figuring out what else you need to know, and adding something positive to the interaction helps prevent both sort of, well, I guess it's just me and a me problem and I'll figure it out. And, and also well, this is a you problem and this isn't my problem and you need to just figure it out, which I think happens a lot. And I'm curious about your perspective on this too, with attitude in the workplace, right? Like, because that's the other thing that this makes me think about is like, with a lot of the examples that you've given, and there were just things that this makes me think of, is just sort of like when people just are perhaps not putting their best foot forward or in a bad mood or have a lot going on. And, what do we do about that?
Mm. Well, my first reaction comes back to curiosity, trying to understand what might be behind that attitude. I love that you kind of brought back trying to not just sort of have a throw my hands up in the air moment of like it's just a them problem or a me problem. But I do think there is only so much that we can do and elicit from people. Having, a conversation to try and get to know someone, to connect someone, typically, is a way to try and have them open up, take an interest in, who they are, and understand their motivations. There are plenty of people who just like going to work and leaving and having a separate life. And that's okay. I think that it's probably a little bit different than sort of like a true difficulty with attitude. But I don't know if I have a surefire answer. I think there is a point where, you can express your desire to support someone and try to learn about them and form a connection in which you can find a way to sort of turn their perspective, turn their attitude, because maybe there is something going on that they're trying to find someone they trust to confide in. But if not, that's where, if there's someone who's performing, actually, I do want to amend maybe what I was saying, because I do think you can be a performer, but attitude does have an impact on the team and morale. And I do think that's important. Now, I think there's a lot that will have to happen before taking kind of disciplinary action on someone for attitude. There's will need to be some actual things that have kind of gone on that warrant that. But that's where I think managers need to start that conversation early. I think it goes along with what I tell people in terms of feedback. Nothing should be a surprise when someone gets to a year end, and that should mean that all throughout the year they're getting feedback or coaching. And if that's attitude, that's something that can be tracked over time and worked on with an employee. It's an expectation of them that they're working collaboratively and positively as much as they can with their coworkers. And that's a job responsibility. So if someone is struggling to execute on that, then that can be a different conversation. But I would start curiosity, connection. I wish I could think of a third C to make it nice, but
two is enough. And it also, and this has me thinking about kind of where this conversation started of like, one of my first reactions was like, I'm allowed to be in a bad mood sometimes. And I think about that a lot in a professional context too, of like, what is the line between I am allowed to have a negative reaction to bad news or unreasonable asks or, difficult workplace situations versus, I'm not comporting myself and regulating myself in a way that supports a healthy, safe work environment. That gets really tricky, and obviously is a way bigger conversation than this because it brings in all these other questions of ableism and cultural stuff and whatever at the bottom of it. But then also this sort of you can't just, that there is such a thing as an attitude problem, and where do we draw those lines? But I love this when you're not the HR professional and not the manager to be able to use a generous pivot and say, okay, well, what can I do to, in the very least, not escalate this situation? And what I can do is notice my own reaction, check in with myself about what I might need, and then add something positive to the situation.
I think, being upset at work happens. It's another place where being vulnerable is a risk. And I think if you can develop a relationship with your manager where you might be able to let them in on a day you're just feeling a little off or not feeling your best, that open communication, I think, goes a long way and is more often than not respected and appreciated. It doesn't mean you're not still expected to perform that day. It doesn't mean, you'll be excused for cursing someone out. Obviously that I think most of us can resist that temptation in a work setting. But if you could even try and find these generous pivots or the generous pause where, maybe you just choose not to have a reaction on top of letting some people into how you're feeling. I know we all have work friends, and it's so, tends to be people we're working closely with, and help them help you by bringing them in to you're having an off day. Odds are someone's going to want to support you or help make you feel better. And who doesn't love that? The other thing you made me think of was that this also comes to resilience, which is another thing that's talked about as a muscle. Being able to say, I just had a fight with my partner and I have to go have a work day, but I got to compartmentalize a little bit and try and move on. And, we'll get back to it in 8 hours when we come back home. Difficult, maybe doesn't work every time. But that's the resilience in working. I mean, there's just working, living in the world, being able to navigate all different types of scenarios in ways that don't cause harm, ways that preserve your safety and security. And given how much time we spend at work, it's a good place to practice.
1,000%. I love to, finding a healthy, productive balance in some of this emotional labor is really what it is, right? And I mean, that goes back to where the term and idea was originally coined, is that people have to regulate their emotions in a very specific way as part of a professional environment. Mm-hmm. And that we do have different expectations of ourselves and how we react to things, and that we should be allowed to be whole people where, we don't, this Severance obviously is this sort of exemplifies when you take this to the extreme where we literally have this very strict separation, and that we know that we don't want that, but where is the boundary? Because we have jobs to do when, for folks that work in a workplace. So I love that there are, I think, some really important nuggets for folks to help start to sort this out of what are appropriate boundaries that are going to be healthy and safe for me and contribute to a productive working environment.
Yeah, well, and that, that goes back to, your point about emotional labor goes back to why we feel so drained at the end of the day. We spend a lot of our day regulating our emotions because of an expectation of how you behave in a workplace. And so, trying to come home and then practice this generous pivot or pause is challenging for that exact reason. So then to try to think about practicing it, during the day, just adds to the spice.
Well, and going back to your barista example, the barista is at work. The
Right.
barista is like in that, that is their situation. And what else is going on for them that they are, which I think, again, like goes back to your original example. You have no idea what's going on with them in their life. And they don't owe us like the smile that corporate probably tells them that they have to. Man, that does grind my gears. I got dinged once on a secret customer visit when I was working a food service job, and it was like I was just existing. I was having a really tough time, and got the feedback of like, oh, you weren't like nice enough, and it's like, why? I was fine.
Yeah, well, it's right, and it's always those always happen when you're on, when you are having a bad day, right? It's like, well, why weren't you here all the other days when I was top of my game, so full of energy? Because people, like we've been saying all along, people are allowed to be upset, have a bad day, and just maybe need to exist for a while. And it's such a good point about the barista being on their work day, because I'm thinking they're also feeling stressed. Maybe they're understaffed and they've got this line in front of them, and maybe someone is snarky to them and they have to choose, am I going to return their snark or am I going to be gracious to a customer? And, they have a slightly different incentive given that they're supposed to be gracious. They're not supposed to be rude to customers, even if someone's rude to them. But this is still an opportunity for them to be able to practice that. And from what we've been talking about, the reward path centers, if you can feel some pride in taking the higher road and responding to someone, maybe that can actually shift your entire mood and perspective on the situation you're in.
Absolutely. And that we don't always get to see the fruits of our labor, right? Like, how many times has someone done an act of kindness for you and you didn't like feel it in the moment, or it didn't immediately make you smile, but you go home and the rest of your day is totally different, and you speak to your partner differently, or, you treat your kids differently because you had this experience that disrupted that cycle of your day. So I think also being open to the fact that we're not always going to get to see it is so important.
Yeah. No, that's a great point too.
So we've gone all over full circle about this lovely, generous pivot. What else should people know about this thing you can do?
I think one of the reasons that this has become a topic of practice in my life is from being in therapy. I'm a big fan of therapy and mental health support, and it's a space where I can also help identify some of these moments where I've done well or messed up in terms of how I react or connect with people. And I say that for everyone to know, this can bring up uncomfortable feelings. You may, whether it's on the surface or someone, going a little bit deeper about things that come out of childhood or other relationships, you may feel some uncomfortable things. You may realize there are conversation topics that could come up that you either have to choose to lean into or choose to sort of respectfully, not engage with. But thinking about our reactions to things brings up how we're feeling, and whether that's on the surface or going into, our deeper motivations or anxieties around how we behave, you may feel a little uncomfortable, may feel vulnerable. That's all good things. Can feel uncomfortable, can be difficult. But one thing I often learn through, the hard way or painfully pushing myself is that vulnerability is good. It's helpful. And if someone isn't able to receive it or match it, you learn a little bit about them and yourself, and maybe where you can find the connection you're looking for.
I love the plug for therapy. And I think it's so helpful for like, that's the place where you take that stuff, right? Like when you notice that you are feeling bent out of shape about people taking too long to order their coffee, you know, you can start to explore that, and then you can bring it into therapy with a person who's trained to help you figure out what's going on there, you know. And when you are upset every day that the sink still has dishes in it, this is a big one for me. You know, being able to take that step back and be like, okay, I need some help exploring why this is so challenging and what is going to be more productive. And the therapy can be the place where you talk through, like, am I, you know, this is what I've been doing, and I'm trying really hard with this coworker to just sort of like pivot generously, you know, when she's being kind of nasty to me, but is this sort of me being a people pleaser again, or where are these boundaries? And so thinking of it as that kind of creative, exploratory space to be able to dig into some of these responses so that you can still be responding in the way that you want to and putting that positive energy out in the world in these interactions.
Oh my God, 100%. I feel like a lot of my earlier experiences in therapy, I was always so solution focused. It was like, okay, this is the thing, this is how I'm feeling about it, but like, how should I solve it? How should I approach this conversation? And that's certainly valuable, and there's a lot there. But it wasn't until we started digging more into like why I felt things or what was behind the feeling. And that's then what enabled me to find ways to create better connection with people. And, you know, for me, it's all about wanting to have connection, have community. I think for a lot of people in the world, we're all just looking to find our place and find connection. And I think this mindfulness, awareness of ourselves and how we feel, why we might feel that way, improves just how we know ourselves, and then how we can relate to people and communicate with people. And that's the connection building.
Mm-hmm. That, I think, is a lovely note to wrap this up on. That is, you tied it right up with a bow. That is beautiful stuff.
I did my best.
Any last words of wisdom about the generous pivot?
I would just say go out and give it a try. Like I said, start with 24 hours. Try to start bringing awareness to how you might respond in a moment. You may not be able to pivot that time, but it just starts with building a new habit, and hopefully you'll find it brings you joy as well.
Good stuff, Brian. Thank you so much for sharing this today.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I'm proud of you for making it to the end of an episode, but I'm sure it wasn't hard because this one was pretty good. Now, remember, this podcast is called Something You Can Do, not things you must do or even things you should do. Some action items contradict each other. That's because there are many ways to live a life. Hopefully this has inspired you to think differently. And if you're feeling really inspired, like, share, subscribe, give us 5 stars, follow us at Something You Can Do Pod on Instagram, send me an email, sycdpodcast@gmail.com. Listen, go out, pivot generously, be kind to one another, and I'll see you next time.